Welcome, everyone. If you're watching on YouTube or if you're following on Zoom, um, the Ask the Rabbi class for today. And I want to thank those who braved the cold and snowy weather for coming out here today. Um, if you'd like to sponsor today's class or a future class, please reach out. You could have my email address, rabbi@jewisherie.com. And if you'd like to submit a question, you can reach out, not reach out, it's a website, jewisherie.com/ask, A-S-K. You can fill out the form there, and we will hopefully try to address the question. Second. Okay, today's question. I had a lot of fun with this one. Why did I have a lot of fun with this one? Because I've gotten this question numerous times. There's not one particular person that submitted the question. It's a question that I've gotten over the past 4 or 5 years, many, many times. If you've ever come to our house to come for a Shabbos meal or any sort of thing we were doing on Shabbos, you may have noticed that in our bathroom we have pre-cut toilet paper. And this, like I said, we got this question more than once, which is basically why? I've never seen this before. And I come to your house during the week and you have regular rolls of toilet paper. They come on Shabbos and it's all pre-cut. What's up with that? So it doesn't happen to be like that. It's not like we just happen to like on, Friday afternoon, like, hey, let's just put up this pre-cut stuff. No, there's a reason for it. And we will go through the background behind it. It's a Jewish thing. It's a Torah thing. And hopefully by the end of the class, God willing, we'll walk away with an understanding and an appreciation. And maybe a little bit of inspiration too. By the way, if anybody would like to get some tea or coffee or cake, it's all in the corner over there. Okay, let's get started. You have your sheets in front of you, source sheets. We're going to start with the original source, the first source, which is from the book of Shemos, Exodus, straight from the Torah, chapter 20, verses 10 and 11. This is actually, if you're familiar with the Ten Commandments, so this is one of them. So it says like this: the seventh day is a Sabbath to God your God. You must not do any work, for in 6 days God made heaven, the earth, the sea, and all that is within them. And he rested on the seventh day. God therefore blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Okay, so we have something that we call Shabbos or Shabbat or Sabbath, whatever language and pronunciation you want to use. That 6 days a week we work, and on the seventh day, Hashem tells us, the Jewish people, to rest, to not do work. Now, what is work? So if we just had the written text and we just tried to examine it and try to figure out what does this word work mean, we want to follow what Hashem asks of us. So we want to not work on Shabbos. So what does work mean? For some people, work means to go to their place of business and to be there from 9 to 5. If they enjoy it, it's not work. If they don't enjoy it, it is work. Anything, it's laborious. Some people might define work differently, but Hashem in His Torah is not giving us an ambiguous thing to not do. He wants us to do something particular, not do something particular. We need to know what it is. So, as it always is, it boils down to this: that when we were given the Torah on Mount Sinai, we were not given the Torah as just a text. We were also given an oral tradition. A tradition was passed down from generation to generation, which helps us understand and explain the text. And the oral tradition was later recorded, written down in what's known as the Mishnah and the Talmud. Talmud may be more familiar. Okay, so let's look at the next source, Talmud, the book of Shabbos, page 49, side B. Okay, it says, it's in the middle of a conversation, middle of a discussion. It says, those above mentioned sages sat again and they raised a dilemma. They had a question. That which we learned, which says the primary categories of labor, which are prohibited by Torah law on Shabbat, are 40 less 1. We call that in English 39. To what does this number correspond? Rabbi Hanina Bar Chama said to them, they correspond to the labors in the sanctuary. Okay, so a number of pieces of information here. The Talmud tells us that there are 39 general acts which cannot be done in Shabbos. These are what's called work. Okay? So the Talmud asks, now we know what these 39 things are. We're going to go through some of them in a minute. To what do they correspond? Why do we have these 39? How come these 39 are considered work and other 39 and other things are not considered work? So the Talmud answers, they correspond to the labors, the works, the acts that were done to construct the sanctuary, the Mishkan in the desert. This is the original Holy Temple in mobile home format. And in the desert, it was dismantled and it was rebuilt. And every time they stopped traveling, they would construct the Mishkan again. So there were 39 particular acts that were done in order to construct the Mishkan. And those 39 acts, those are the things that we cannot do on Shabbos. Okay? Fine. Next source. This is from the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe was the founder of the Chabad Hasidic movement, founder of Chabad. In his Code of Jewish Law, in chapter 301, I'm getting a party over here. The Alter Rebbe writes like this. The Torah made an undefined statement with regard to Shabbos. Do not perform any melacha, which literally means work or labor. It did not, however, define the actions whose performance is called melacha. Melacha is Hebrew. And which actions are not called melacha. Meaning if we just open up the book, we open the Torah, it just says don't do melacha, don't do work. We don't know what that means. Turn the page. The Torah placed the passage forbidding labor on Shabbos in direct proximity to the description of the work necessary to construct the sanctuary, to teach that the labors necessary to build the sanctuary do not supersede the Shabbos prohibitions. From this it is derived that any melacha, any work that was considered important with regard to the construction of the sanctuary, is considered as a melacha with regard to the Shabbos prohibitions. In other words, if you open up the Torah, you'll see that the Hashem he instructs about keeping Shabbos. Okay? Immediately after that, it goes on to discussing the construction of the Mishkan in the desert. The sages ask, why are these two things next to each other? They don't seem to have any connection. The answer is, based on this information that we have from tradition, that the acts that were used to construct the Mishkan, those things do not supersede the Shabbos. In other words, those things cannot be done on Shabbos. Those are the forbidden labors. And there's 39 of them. Okay. So what are these 39 things? We're going to go through some of them, but we'll see the listed out over here. So the next source, Rambam's Mishnah Torah. Rambam is Maimonides. His book of the Mishnah Torah, Laws of Shabbos, chapter 7. He writes like this. With regard to the forbidden labors for which one is liable, there are primary categories and their derivatives. In other words, there's 39 things that were done and 39 things that we cannot do on Shabbos. These are general categories, general headers, I guess you could say. There are other acts that are under these headers, which are not exactly the same thing, but they share a common principle. And those are also forbidden as well. Okay? The sum of all the primary categories of forbidden labor are 40 minus 1. Okay? There's a reason why it says 40 minus 1. Repeated, it's always referred to as 40 minus 1 instead of just saying 39. There's a reason for it. We're not getting into it in this class. Okay? What are the 39 things? They include 1, plowing, 2, sowing, reaping, you skipped a few, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, skip a few more, tying, untying, sewing, tearing, building, demolishing, beating with a hammer, explain more later what that means, cutting, kindling a flame, extinguishing a flame, and transferring an object from one domain to another. Okay? If you noticed, I underlined 3 of them. Tearing, beating with a hammer, and cutting. Okay? I underlined them because these are directly relevant to the conversation of today. Okay. The reason it's directly related is because when it comes to toilet paper, let's back up a second. I'll answer the question. The reason why we pre-cut our toilet paper before Shabbos is because we cannot tear toilet paper on Shabbos. That's the reason why. So to avoid having to tear it on Shabbos, or to avoid tearing it on Shabbos, we tear it before Shabbos, and that avoids that issue. The things that are directly related to this conversation are tearing, beating with a hammer, and cutting. These are the 3 categories of forbidden works which might be relevant to why we don't do this. Let's see. Let's focus first on tearing. Okay? Bottom of the page. This is from the Tosefta of the book of Shabbos, chapter 17, law 9. It says, One may tear the hide. It's talking about hide of an animal. One may tear the hide which is on the opening of a barrel of wine. So back in those days, about 2,000 years ago or so, they had barrels of wine, much like we have today. I guess one of the ways they would cover the barrel to keep it sealed was they would take a piece of hide from an animal, they'd stretch it over the top, and seal it in some way, and apparently they seal it so good, the only way really you can open it, I mean, one of the ways I guess you could open it is by tearing it. You have to tear through the hide. Okay? The Tosefta rules, you're allowed to tear the hide on Shabbos in order to access your wine. Didn't we just say that tearing is forbidden? One of the 39 forbidden acts on Shabbos is tearing. But it says clearly, one may tear the hide which is on the opening of the barrel of wine. Okay. So the question is, and this is what much of the book of Shabbat in Talmud is discussing, and how it comes later into the commentaries and then the Code of Jewish Law and the commentaries on the Code of Jewish Law, all working around trying to define what exactly is each of these forbidden works. Okay? For example, baking. What is the definition of baking? How do you define baking? What do you mean? You take bread, put it in the oven. That's not a definition of a principle. That's a definition of an act. That's telling me what it looks like. What is the defining factor which makes baking baking? And if you do some other thing which looks like baking, it's not baking. What is the distinctive feature? So this is done with all the 39 works, and we're focusing today on tearing and a couple of them. What exactly is tearing? Okay, we see tearing is forbidden, but we see clearly also that one may tear hide from the top of the barrel to open the barrel. So there is a form of tearing that's permitted. So how do I know which one's which? That's what we're going to get at. The flip side of this, let's see the next source on the top of the next page. The same Rambam, his same Mishnah Torah, Laws of Shabbos. This is from chapter 23, law number 6. And also, the same wording is brought in the Code of Jewish Law, chapter 340, law 13. It says, we may not break a shard or tear a piece of paper, since this resembles preparing a utensil. Did anybody catch what sounded a little bit strange about that? First of all, we said we can't tear paper. We just said we could tear hide. But paper we can't tear. But why can't we tear paper? It resembles preparing a utensil. What about tearing? It should say, we may not break a shard or tear a piece of paper. Why can't you tear a piece of paper? Because it's tearing. You can't tear on Shabbat. That's not what it says.
How does tearing a piece of paper resemble preparing a utensil?
We'll get there. It's tearing, just in short, it's tearing a piece of paper for a particular purpose, to use it for something. So the Mishnah Berurah is a very, very important work. It's technically a commentary on the Code of Jewish Law, but it's also his rulings are followed by much of world Jewry today. In his commentary on the Code of Jewish Law on this law, he writes like this: it appears that one who tears in order to correct, in other words, in order to make a utensil, preparing a utensil, is similar to making a utensil. One who tears in order to correct is liable due to the prohibition of tearing. Why is tearing not mentioned here? He asked the question explicitly. If tearing is something that's prohibited, why isn't it mentioned tearing? Okay, we're going to leave you with a question. We'll get back to it. Let's move on to the next one, cutting. Okay, cutting and tearing are not the same thing, as we'll see now. So the Alter Rebbe's Code of Jewish Law, chapter 314, law number 16. The reason I'm bringing from the Alter Rebbe's Code of Jewish Law, there's original Code of Jewish Law, but he just tells you the laws. He didn't tell you the reasons behind them. The Alter Rebbe did this incredible feat. He accomplished that he wrote down the laws with their reasonings briefly, which is a very difficult thing to do. The reasonings are very, very, it's a huge, it's a huge amount of information, and he's cramming it into a few lines. So let's see what's the deal with cutting. One who cuts an animal hide and is careful to cut it in the precise measure he requires, for example, he cuts it for straps and for sandals. One who does this is performing a task that is forbidden as one of the primary categories of forbidden labor. For in the sanctuary, in the Mishkan, they would cut the hides of the rams and the techashim, type of animal, precisely to make a covering for the tent of the sanctuary. Anyone who cuts an article that is not attached to the ground or to a living being, cutting it in a precise measure, performs a derivative of the forbidden labor of cutting. However, it is permitted to cut other objects that are not attached, provided one does not intend to cut with a precise measure. Two, one does not cut them into very small pieces. And also, there's a third reason which I didn't quote. Not to confuse everybody. Okay. In other words, like this. Cutting does not mean just cutting an object, taking a knife and cutting something in half. That's not what cutting is in this context. Cutting, as regards to as far as Shabbos is concerned, the forbidden cutting, which we can't do, is cutting to a particular size. Okay? So if somebody goes on Shabbos and they say, I have this piece of paper, I want to cut it to about 4 inches by 4 inches. You can't do that. You can't, it's forbidden. That's the cutting that we're talking about. So when it comes to toilet paper, cutting is not really an issue. It's not. Why? Because when one uses toilet paper, they're not trying to cut it to a particular size. Now, I know there's perforations. I know that the company decided this is a good size for you, but if the company made the little space department a little differently, like 2 inches this way or 5 inches that way, you wouldn't really care. You just need a general size. Okay, some people, and everybody's different. That being the case, this does not go into the category of cutting in the slightest. You're not trying to cut it to a particular measurement. 18 inches. Nobody's doing that. Nobody takes a ruler to the bathroom. At least I hope not. And finally, preparing your utensil. Oh, you know what? Let's go back to the tearing thing will be addressed in a second. The last thing we need to address is preparing utensil. Okay. The third one we mentioned, the third forbidden labor, which we're going to focus on, was called make bepatish. What does make bepatish mean?
Finishing touch.
Finishing touch. Very good. Make bepatish literally means the hammer blow. That's what it means. Okay. When you construct I'm not a metal worker. I know the guy who made our menorah here, Adam, in Erie. So he works with metal, and I'm sure he does this kind of thing. When you work with metal and you're trying to make it smooth, and maybe nowadays do it a little differently, but back in the day, you have a hammer and you lightly tap the metal to kind of straighten it. And that's like the final thing that you're doing. You do that little hammer blow. That's the last smoothing of the metal object. You finished. The Torah says this idea of finishing an act, finishing an object, finishing it off, is a forbidden labor. It's a separate thing.
So is this also like you're knitting, you finish the sweater, you do the last stitch?
Maybe, but knitting itself is a problem.
Shabbos. Oh. You can do all of it, but not the last stitch.
No, knitting the can't touch the Shabbos. Yeah. So it has a lot of different where it plays out. So what the Alter Rebbe, we're going to see in the next source, the Alter Rebbe's Code of Jewish Law, is going to go through this thing. It's not going to be directly talking about toilet paper. We're talking about paper. But we'll see. The Alter is going to address tearing. He's not going to address cutting. He's going to address tearing and preparing a utensil, or the final hammer blow. Okay. Surprisingly, according to the Alter Rebbe, the Mishnah Brewer, who we mentioned earlier, he doesn't go with this line of reasoning. But this is how we go. And I was told by a rabbi who knows this stuff better than I do, that the Alter, he's seen it quoted in a book that the Alter Rebbe's solution to this dilemma that is brought up by the Mishnah Berurah about why doesn't the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, mention tearing in regards to paper as a reason for prohibiting. The Alter Rebbe's explanation is the most solid. Okay. The reason why the Code of Jewish Law does not mention tearing by paper, why that's not the reason for its prohibition, is because simply that it's not a reason for prohibition. It's that tearing is not an issue in that case, and we'll see why in a moment. But before we get there, Rambam's Mishnah Torah, the Laws of Shabbos, chapter 10, law number 16. A person who gives the final blow with a hammer is liable. On Shabbos, meaning. Similarly, a person who performs any activity that represents the completion of a task is liable for performing a derivative of dealing the final hammer blow. So anything that a person does, again, there's the definitions of these things, but anything that a person does on Shabbos that is the completion of an act, the completion of a thing, is prohibited. The Alter Rebbe is going to explain to us that tearing a paper, not just tearing a paper because you're bored and you tear a paper, but tearing a paper for a particular purpose, touches on three issues, but it's only really problematic for one reason. It's not a problem because of cutting. It's not a reason. It's not a problem because of tearing even. It's a problem because of preparing a utensil. Let's see inside. The next source, Alter Rebbe's Code of Jewish Law, chapter 3:4. Cutting an object that was already separated from its source of nourishment is permitted, provided one is not careful to cut in a precise measure, as stated in chapter 3:14. Okay, like we said earlier, if you're not cutting to a precise size, it's fine. Going further, nevertheless, if by doing so the person makes the object fit to be used for a purpose, he is liable for fashioning an implement, a tool, a utensil, a thing. Therefore, one may not tear a paper if the person is doing so to use it for a purpose, because it is considered as if one fashioned an implement. So tearing a paper is not problematic. Tearing a paper to use it for a particular purpose, that's a big issue. Okay? Now, the author in this parenthesis is going to explain to us why is tearing not an issue in this case. There is, however, no prohibition in doing so because of the concern of the forbidden labor of tearing. Why not? Since that forbidden labor applies only when one separates many entities that have previously been joined together. For example, when one tears a garment woven from many strands. In contrast, a piece of paper is a single entity. Hence, one does not incur liability for the forbidden labor of tearing when he tears and cuts it. Next side, for this reason, it is permitted to tear a piece of leather off the opening of a barrel of wine, as stated in section 314. This is what we started with. This is permitted because the leather is a single entity, and the prohibition against tearing does not apply to it. Only the prohibition against cutting when one is careful to cut in a precise measure, as stated in that source. And say this in other words. Tearing, the forbidden labor on Shabbos of tearing, the opposite of that is stitching. That's the opposite labor, okay? Just like writing is one of the forbidden acts, erasing is the opposite of that. Stitching is defined as taking two objects, two things, two entities, and sticking them together, at least two things, which is what stitching is and sewing is. You're taking thread and you're putting it together, different threads. The opposite of that is taking different entities that are stuck together and separating them. That's tearing. If you have an object that's one entity, it's one piece, and you tear it, that's not the same thing. Oh, we have a defining feature now. Something that is one entity, like a piece of hide, like we just said. Hide is not made up of pieces. It's one piece. Paper is technically made from a bunch of little tiny pieces of pulp, whatever it is. But at the end of the day, facts on the ground. It's a one piece of paper. It's not made of a bunch of stuff. Tearing that is not an issue. Okay. I quoted, the last thing I quoted here is from a book called Shmiras HaShabbos, or in Hebrew, in English, I quoted from the Hebrew version because I don't actually own the English version. There's an English version of the book. It's called Shmiras HaShabbat, if you're interested. It's by Rabbi Shimon Gadassi, an Israeli rabbi. So he puts it all very, very nicely. What he's talking about here is talking specifically about toilet paper. See, black on white. He says, there is no prohibition of tearing when one tears hide or paper, since the prohibited act of tearing is specifically when one tears an object comprised of many individual pieces, similar to an article of clothing. But if one tears them to a specific size, they are liable due to the prohibition of cutting. Before we go further, okay, we said that we pre-cut toilet paper before Shabbos in order to avoid this entire issue. What if somebody forgot to do so? Or they don't have access to it, whatever the reason is. All they have is a roll of toilet paper. What can they do? So let's see what he says. One who needs to use the restroom on Shabbos and there is no pre-cut toilet paper, if they act leniently to tear the toilet paper, they have on who to rely. They should tear it in an abnormal manner, with their elbow, for example, or their knuckles, and try not to tear it on the perforation. Now, there are different rabbis who rule differently in this. Some say there's no issue at all, even to tear it on the perforation. In this case, meaning if you have no other option, okay, there's nothing available. You can even tear it on the perforation. What he's saying is you can't tear it. You should try to avoid tearing on the perforation. Some say I'll say it, but I'm not necessarily recommending you do it. It's just not easy to use the toilet paper without tearing it and then tear it. I know it sounds a little strange. But this is a good way that he's presenting it, to try to tear it in an abnormal manner and not try not tear it in the perforation. And the last, If you turn to the next page, it's the page that looks like this. Thank you, Yesela. This is a copy from the Likutei Sichos, the collected talks of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, volume 1, page 193. This is in Yiddish and without the vowels. So if you have trouble reading it, totally understandable. This was a talk regarding the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the sanctuary, which you just mentioned a few times. I'm trying to elevate this conversation so it's not just about Jewish law, but it's something with a little more juice to it. So the Rebbe says like this: From Pasukei la'advarim gomer lent up the Gemara the Lamites Malachas v'Chazanan also on Shabbos. So the Rebbe says one of the verses in the Torah teaches us, the Talmud learns from this verse, the 39 acts which are forbidden on Shabbos. When the Gemara sagt, Malacha da habi b'mishkan have a malacha, a malacha was given in Mishkan haste a malacha, and it is also on Shabbos. That the Talmud says that a malacha, a work which is done in the Mishkan, is a work that is forbidden on Shabbos. Von dem was die Lamites Malachas lernt man von die Malachas Hamishkan ist doch verstandig as die Lamites Malachas sind verbunden mit dem Malachas Hamishkan. Says the Rebbe, from this that the 39 works, labors of Shabbos are learned from the 39 acts or labors of the Mishkan. It's understood from this that the 39 acts of labor are connected with the works that were done in the Mishkan. In other words, it's not just two happen to be like Hashem decided, these things are done in the Mishkan, let's also apply it to Shabbos. No, the two topics internally share a connection. The construction of the Mishkan and acting on Shabbos. Es ist doch bewusst, als jeder Limud in Torah ist nicht zufällig, chas v'sholom, nor as der Melamed mit Lamed seinen bepnimius einin. It's known that things that are learned, that are extrapolated in Torah, it's not just happens to be that way, God forbid. Rather, the thing that is teaching us and the thing that is learned out from that internally are one topic, they're one concept. Und sehr verbunden ist zwei Indike. So the Rebbe says that the connection between Shabbos, the acts of Shabbos, and the acts of the Mishkan is a twofold connection. One, the Sheidish from the Lamites Malachas is Malachas HaMishkan. Das heißt, as alle Malachas kommen beishtalshelis from Malachas HaMishkan. The root of these 39 acts of labor come from the acts of the Mishkan. In other words, work, labor, the idea that we can do something, that we can work in a certain way, this comes from a holy source. It comes from the Mishkan. Two, der Fahrt ist euch der Ziel und Tachlis von aller Malacha ist euch Malachas Hashus zu machen durch sie am Mishkan v'dirulei Yisborech as wie es steht b'chol derech echadei. The purpose of the Mishkan was to bring godliness down into this world. Hashem's presence should be revealed in this world. That's what the purpose of this thing was. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the Rebbe says in the next part of this that the Mishkan is more like a prototype for the rest of the world. Meaning that Hashem's presence, the godliness should be revealed and exposed in the Mishkan is the way it was practically, but the world at large also needs to be working toward that goal. The world has to become a home for Hashem, a home for his presence. And we do this through melacha, through work. What does work mean? Work means that acting according to what Torah says, according to what Hashem wants. That in our day-to-day activities, eating, sleeping, exercise, our business, we should use that as a way of an opportunity to introduce godliness into our lives. Just an example that just came to mind. There's a doctor in 1977, after the Rebbe suffered a heart attack, Simchas Torah. So the doctors were treating him. The doctors were amazed at the Rebbe's medical knowledge, and sometimes there was surpassed the doctors. And one of the doctors said he needed to take some from blood from the Rebbe. So he had to use a syringe to take some blood out. And the Rebbe asked him, well, how does this thing work? Guaranteed, the Rebbe knew exactly how the thing works. Not even a question. But he's trying to start a conversation. So he explained the way that you could explain better than I do. There's a vacuum that's created when you pull the syringe back. And the Rebbe used this idea, the concept of a syringe, to explain something in serving Hashem. It's the exact same concept. I don't remember exactly the details of it. And the doctor was amazed. Meaning the profession of being a doctor shouldn't just be what it is, as just helping people, which is important, extremely important. and they could continue doing so with tremendous success. In addition to that, it's important that you should introduce and make it a holy profession, a holy activity, something that has a deeper purpose to it, something more meaningful. For further reading, you see on the next page, I put 2 suggested books of reading versus Shmira to Shabbat. You can find this online. It's available. It's the last thing we quoted. It's the Laws of Shabbat. It's translated and written. If you can read the words, it's very hard to read. So I get a blurry picture here. So the Laws of Shabbat explained clearly and simple terminology. It's a little hard to read. That's what it says. And the other book is the English translation of the Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe's Code of Jewish Law, beautifully translated into English by the Sichos in English Publication Society. And they did a beautiful job. It's very, very well done. It's part of a set. I put a picture here of the one that we were quoting from a lot in this class, volume 6. Okay, we're going to close the Zoom and the recording. And if anybody has any questions, you're welcome to ask. Absolutely. Close that. Have a great day.